I feel like I need to make this addendum because there's so much intellectual bad faith in the system, as it were. The vampirism of the identity politics, identitarian narrative is so delusional and and projects so much, and its pseudo intellectualism is so voracious at finding evidence for its own worldview and shoring up its own sort of lack of sort of accountability of even. I mean, I actually criticized Bret Weinstein almost on in a comment that I made under the Black Round Table, in that I didn't like his point. I mean, in some sense, it was a point that is worthy to be raised, but it should have been raised in order to be defeated. It should have been raised in order to be put down and expelled as essentially the another formula of actually what the problem in thinking is, which is essentially his kind of idea that bad luck has been redistributed against identity factions disproportionately, and that is a form of injustice. And essentially that, I mean, my comment in that was, well, that's a symptom. That's not, you can't deal with that issue directly. That issue is a symptom of all the other problems that are actually the real problems that need to be solved, and that is just another symptom. And trying to deal with that is a catch-22. It's putting the cart before the horse, and it doesn't get you anywhere. And in some sense, that formulation of a problem is fundamentally insoluble. Therefore, it is a wrong way to frame it, and in some sense it entrenches you into the ethnocentric or the group-centric moralizing, the corrupt moralizing. It is the same kind of problematic thinking as the reparations, as it is the same kind of toxic strategy as the kind of reparations way of addressing things, rather than actually having a decent society that is promoting non-racialism and is targeting disadvantage and is trying to solve the problems of disadvantage. And essentially that framework of dealing with the problem, then at least when let's say the problematic thinkers eventually relent into seeing the problem like that, then you can actually get real traction and real progress that doesn't sort of undermine itself into these toxic self-fulfilling prophecies of it's too convenient to get into that kind of reductive bullshit, essentially, especially when it doesn't hold true. It only holds true for the statistic. It doesn't hold true for the individual. And it only works in as much as you completely possess the individual of this kind of group identity, in some sense. It is already to make the moral concession that moral consideration vests in the group and not in the individual. And so it's just fundamentally problematic from the start. That's a sort of an example of I think, bad moral thinking, or corrupt moral thinking rather. But in the same way, people make intellectual rationalizations in which they kind of protect these simplified, reductive ways of navigating complicated problems. And Bret is certain. I mean, perhaps Bret can inform me, because every time he brings up this point, I have the same irksome response to it, which is like, why are you bringing up this insoluble framework? Like, yes, that is what the proponents of identity politics are leveraging. That is what they are whining about. That is what they're complaining about. And it's a catch-22. It can't be solved. So they need to be told, shut the fuck up. It's a corrupt moral question that precipitates bad policy, bad solutions that don't work. And then when their bad solutions don't fail, then they double down and they demand even more. And create even more identity-conscious, toxic cesspool of a disgusting slide into the doom spiral of essentially insoluble politics, which are fundamentally also totalitarian politics, which are completely illiberal, which are because they're premised and founded on an illiberal. They proceed from an illiberal framework. So that every time Bret brings up that point, and essentially I think he did kind of get some kind of feedback in the black intellectual roundtable. He did get that kind of feedback, but it wasn't as pointed as perhaps as I just articulated it. Again, that is a minor example in some sense, but essentially this is why I get very pissed off when people go after Trump. And I just want to say that I make a lot of political commentary all the time, And I can understand how superficially someone can see what I'm saying about identity politics and apply it to Trump's rhetoric. And I just want to disabuse people of that conflation and that bad thinking. And I just want to clean up this point. And this is essentially going to be an addendum just essentially on President Trump, perhaps. The reason why Trump is so toxic to the identitarians and to the SJW fascists and to the people on the so-called left is because he undermines their narrative. He undermines their polemic completely. And essentially because he does essentially use rhetoric and use devices which, like, in a very vague and loose way, in a very, if you don't look at the substance of anything, you could say that he is sort of doing some of the things that I describe as the identitarians doing. And in some sense, I want to say that he's not doing anything like that. You know, the kind of nationalism that Trump stands for, the kind of identity that Trump stands for, is a solid American identity which is completely justifiable and moral within municipal politics, within the politics of a nation. It's not wrong to have essentially a common, universal, civil identity in which that's how you operate the rule of law, that's how you operate equality before the law, that's how you have a polity, that's how you have a liberal polity, is by having a common identity. And the civic nationalism that Trump represents and the identity that Trump is trying to champion, the identity of the American, is completely justifiable and moral in that context. And to try to paint him as some kind of identitarian demagogue, just because he's undermining the rhetoric and the narrative of the actual totalitarian fascistic identitarians, is a kind of intellectual dishonesty on the scale of which is just, it blows my mind just how fundamentally intellectually bankrupt it is. And for all, let's say, practical intents and purpose, in some sense that's the only thing that you can get Trump on, is that, let's say, he's practically ineffectual, perhaps. You could have a specific complaint. And in some sense, all of those complaints, I don't even know how honest they are, because the partisan hackery in the press and also the pseudo-intellectual establishment to cultivate banks of facts, which are just completely irrelevant facts. I mean, if I just look at any issue, whenever I look at any issue under a microscope, I see that essentially what Trump is saying is effectively the right response. And in some sense, he is being so poorly framed in such a dishonest way with all these fake facts essentially leveraged against him. I mean, he's perfectly correct when he says that the case numbers of COVID-19 in America going up is a reflection of the extra testing that America does. That's just factually true. They go into parking lots and they test people in public. They don't do that in Europe. They don't do that in other countries. They don't do that in my country. In fact, if you look at any of the real experts, Professor Gupta from Oxford says that no government should be publishing confirmed cases. Confirmed cases is an irrelevant statistic. It is utterly meaningless. It means nothing. You know, if anything, Trump is guilty of not, in interviews, let's just say, pushing back harder on this point and being, let's say, slightly more precise about how it is fake news. But it is completely fake news. I mean, essentially, this whole statistic about confirmed cases is just such an irrelevant, bad number that is just, it holds no water. It is a football created by a hysterical press that is used to pushing narrative bullshit. And even Fox News falls for this because they don't essentially have, they don't have, I guess, intelligent enough editors to resist the core of whatever like essentially they are plugged into the pseudo-intellectual filth that the left, keeps on manufacturing, essentially. And then they've got their armies of so-called credentialed experts which coo along with the bullshit, essentially. And, I mean, Sam Harris, I think, sadly, I mean, I just saw an interview of Sam Harris with, what's his name? The one that everyone wanted on the Democratic side, that Sam Harris made famous in the first place. Oh my word, why am I so bad with names? Yang. I can't remember his first name, but the UBI the UBI candidate, and I mean I can see why people. I mean I think I'm even skeptical of UBI, and I mean I you know I would have to be persuaded on actual. Anyway, this is perhaps a tangent, but I mean the reason why you don't perhaps trust people with these supposedly big ideas, I mean, is when they don't seem to have an independent sense of intellectual integrity. You know, they're just part of going along with the flow in some greater sense. And I mean, and looking at Sam Harris, I mean, Sam Harris is you know, I mean, it looks like he's captured by sort of a left-wing echo chamber, because that's all of the articles that all of his friends, you know, and so they'll read into COVID, and they will, I don't know, you know, the kind of, these so-called intelligent people. Okay, I'm not making precise points about this, but I guess I had a whole perhaps a video that I wanted to make about Yang and Sam Harris, but and I shouldn't interject it into this point about Trump, but I mean, in some sense, Yang and Sam Harris's criticism of Trump is completely, it's wrong-headed, because in some sense they are exactly exemplifying the the kind of Trumpian politics which is actually why Trump deserves to continue to win and succeed, is because he represents a kind of integrity which just does not exist otherwise. That Trump, I mean, they actually criticized Trump for despoiling the memory of John McCain or something like that. Um, and that the Republic and then they well, they were hard on the Republican Party for going along with Trump on sort of on these, on throwing these people under the bus or whatever. And in some sense, I think I mean, I don't know about the actual underlying issue of that, but I think in some sense that is actually fundamentally what makes Trump authentic and genuine, is that at least you know whatever he says, it's coming from him. And he does use language in a bit of a vague way, because he uses it to send signals, and because he cares about being effective and getting things done, and you do that by being able to send signals. And if you sort of stick to the letter and not to the spirit and the intuition that he's communicating, then obviously, you know, so I mean, in some sense, the intuition and that intuition form of communication means that he can be very effective, he can get a lot done, and essentially he's relying on the substantive under the underlying substantive point of what he's making, which does require some investigation, and the journalists are not interested in actually acclimatizing themselves to the real facts, and they'll just find some expert that they'll put up there to create some sort of drama shitstorm, and it's just a never-ending, you know, and so in some sense, it's interesting that when people criticize Trump, I think they do sort of make him stronger, and they do undermine their own credibility in some sense. And I think that that is roughly right. That is roughly actually, they should be undermining their own credibility, because they don't have credibility, and they are proving it by not essentially admiring Trump, at least the style of Trump's politics. They would at least manufacture a bit more authenticity or intellectual, they would profess at least a better, I think, form of intellectual authenticity if they were to openly admire these elements in the Trump arsenal, as it were, and try to inculcate them into politics. But they won't, because they are doing dishonest things, because Yang is endorsing Joe Biden. And Sam Harris is right there helping him, making a lesser of two evils argument, essentially. And so now, if Yang does have any integrity, you have to say, well, it's private integrity. Like you have to hope, okay, well, he's still the right guy. He's saying what he has to say to play the political game, and behind closed doors, we'll hope that he has the integrity that he sort of represents in a kind of in a hopefulness, and it's sort of this is what Obama essentially ended up representing, and it's and Trump as a cultural novation is actually necessary, and to the extent to which that he's not being admired for the instruments in his arsenal that he brings to the table, it just proves how broken the culture is and how necessary it is that hopefully he continues to win and succeed, and just how broken authenticity is essentially in intellectual discourse in America and such. But yeah, I just wanted to say that essentially he does in some sense mirror the identitarian script, but he applies it solely in the service of civic nationalism, in which there is no division within the country. He does not make categorical divisions like the identitarians do. So to kind of call him, dog whistling and all these sorts of things. I mean, again, like these things, it's just like the impeachment. Sam Harris thinks that there was something to the impeachment. I mean, what utter bullshit. The impeachment only functions if you can know his intention. In some sense, it would have only been against the law for his intention to have the wrong priority in some sense. In some sense, you could only interpret it as a crime based solely on that single charge of the intent, his supposed, his actual state of mind in making it, his mood in making it. I mean, and crimes that are based on the interpretation of someone's intention, that are not even sort of objectively ascertainable in that sense. I mean, it's utterly, you can never prove that beyond reasonable doubt, essentially. Because, I mean, literally, it turns literally on essentially a confession. You need to get them to confess guilt in order to actually be able to prove it at all. I mean, it's utterly disgusting. I do actually have a more detailed treatment of this issue. I don't know if I put it in a recording form or not, but I mean, I would call this very much like a show trial. The impeachment of Trump, I think, legally held so little water. And it's ironic as well that essentially the establishment, the journalistic establishment, actually turns a corruption story about Joe Biden into an impeachment claim against Trump. I mean, you just have to think about that. They repurposed what should have been a problem for them into proof of supposedly Trump's corruption. I mean, it's mind-boggling just how disorientating and unhinged and deranged this is. I mean, it just shows you just how fundamentally corrupt everything is. And I mean, I would actually like to get into the details of the of the legal. I mean, it's interesting because the legal question around the impeachment and how the legal argument is framed, in some sense, it is a mirror of the ideological doubling down and the ideological kind of. It's ironically very similar to how the pseudo-intellectualism functions on this kind of totalitarian bent. and for Sam Harris to disgustingly say that the Republicans need to go through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, like, really. It's just, it's too much to listen to this trash. Just this utter, it's like, it's cognitive dissonance on a level that is just, it's hard to fathom. Just essentially because Trump speaks in broad, vague language sometimes, and so that allows you to project whatever the fuck you want to project, Sam Harris. Just because you've got a gaggle of peanut gallery armchair critics that can supposedly all be experts in something, cooing along with some narrative, and then you can attach that narrative onto someone, and you can't even see reality, and it's just I mean, it just gets a bit too disgusting. I mean, you can see this in how they have to impugn his intentions and his integrity. Essentially, it all hinges on an ad hominem attack. To make their narrative fit, it all rests on this kind of ad hominem denigration. And it is disgusting. It is vacuous. And when you go along with that, you really do shed your own credibility. Rightly so. And Yang and Sam Harris, to my mind, they have lost a huge amount of, I always thought Sam Harris had some kind of, in some sense he's only ever, in my mind, as an intellectual, had some superficial kind of rational, I've seen him make comments on some issues that I do respect his opinion on those comments, but I've seen him have intelligent conversations with Coleman Hughes on Coleman's podcast on race and racism and systemic racism and reparations and stuff. So he can think about complicated things, but you put him into any kind of situation where I guess there are groups and vested interests, and he doesn't have that independent sense of, I guess, or he can't stick his head above the parapet, or he can't open his eyes beyond the filter that his sort of his I guess Trump is just too much of a sort of a catnip to these kinds of I've described Sam Harris also as having a slight bit of what I call cerebral histrionic capture in terms of perhaps his own personal psychology. But anyway, I'm going to stop this addendum now. I've probably said everything, but in some sense that is the archetype for these journalists, for these for this narrative that Trump is putting a pin into, that Trump is confronting and challenging, and you can see the kind of you can see what comes out of the woodwork, and the kinds of legions that flock to the to some kind of orthodoxy. To not say nice things about Trump when he's doing such an important cultural function. And I do really think that a lot of these so-called scandals, the reason why they haven't stuck is not because journalism has been too hysterically, obviously partisanly motivated to take him down, that they've found so many that none of them have stuck Sam Harris. It's because they're all fabricated, pretty much, out of very thin sort of elements that, and too many of them have not only not stuck, but when you actually hear more details, you just realize just how the so-called left is essentially it's just a vehicle for essentially this kind of this conglomerated mob of essentially a kind of ideological borderline personality disorder that has to sort of find somebody else to be codependent with, that it can scapegoat and blame everything on and externalize account or responsibility, so that it can continue to weave its narrative expectations and sort of sense of self-entitlement. It's safe and simple, kind of reliable way of extracting. It's an intellectual parasite essentially, and when I see people that are part of this sort of part of this parasitic, kind of conglomerate, I do see it as bad faith. I do see even the details of what they say as not ringing true, as not resonating, even in their own conception. It's just so cherry-picked, essentially. And it's not honest about the real situation, anyway. Or it's so superficial that it's nescient. And I also made a whole video about nescience and Sam Harris, and the kind of the psychological nescience that I go into detail. Anyway, I'll stop this recording.